Today, I'm delighted to talk to Will Blackburn. He is come from technology business background, but he's been extraordinarily involved in supporting Ukraine in the creation of and supply of convoys of essential materials throughout the war. He's even written a book about that experience and the multiple convoys that he's helped to enable and being part of it. He lives in Poland now, so of course he's much closer to that sense of being near the front line, near the existential threat than perhaps we are in Britain and Western Europe. And I'm really keen to learn from Will's firsthand experience of working with, dealing with Ukrainians, and really trying to get these convoys together to help Ukraine, not just still stay in the fight, but work towards a Ukrainian victory. Will, welcome to Silicon Curtain.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me. I have to say, it's a huge honor to be on your podcast. I've been watching Silicon Curtain really from the get-go, and to be on the Silicon Curtain itself is a huge honor. And thank you so much for having me.
What I find interesting is that it's brilliant having guests from academia, historians, and so on, but actually some of the episodes that people connect with most and where you get the most enthusiastic comments are those where we talk to people either on the front lines or who've been training Ukrainian troops or involved in civil society. It's basically people who have first-hand experience. There's a kind of energy and an insight talking to people who have that direct experience that really works very well, in this format and with the audience. Well, let's jump into that. We're not going to dwell hugely on your background as a sort of technologist. We actually come from, I guess, sort of similar areas. Before we hit record, we're talking about software and working with teams and so on. And of course, that transitions to Ukrainian innovation. But the key question for me is, lots of people live in Poland, but you've become extraordinarily involved and active. What was the trigger and the motivation for you?
The main trigger, I think, and thinking back to the terrible days of February 2 years ago, was the sudden arrival of refugees in the town where we lived. It sounds silly in a way because, of course, Poland's next door and refugees on the news were arriving. It was very clear that was happening. But it was actually when they arrived in the hometown itself, and you'd see groups of people in parks, you'd see people queuing for passport photos for temporary ID. And it suddenly became very real. And while I was trying to do that software work you were talking about, I suddenly thought, actually, this is ridiculous. I need to do something to help. What we initially did was what a lot of people did was make sure we sort of supplied the local depot with food, shoes, anything we could find. But I talked to, and he's now a local politician, actually, the guy who runs our local beach bar, because we live on the Baltic coast. And he said, actually, what Ukraine really needs is boots, it needs socks, it needs military supplies in the sense of clothing. And to that end, I thought, well, I was in the TA many years ago, Territorial Army, for those who aren't familiar with that acronym. And for reasons which I sort of explain in the book, mainly military hoarding, I'd hung on to a lot of military kit and actually brought it with us to Poland when we moved here. My wife quite rightly said, well, just give it to the people supporting Ukraine. We turned up with a load of old military kit, a helmet, boots, you name it. And that triggered them to sort of think, well, who is this Brit who's living in the town and seems to have access to military clothing? Fighting clothes and shoes was how it was described, which made me laugh. And from there, I thought, well, hang on, I've donated everything I can, but I know a lot of people in the UK, former soldiers, former TA people, who, like me, have hung on to kit. Now, if they were to donate it, I could get it over to the UK, to Poland. And then from there, it can be delivered into Ukraine. And that's what happened initially. But the volumes that started arriving were so great that we had to sort of co-opt, if that's the right word, the removal company that had moved us over from UK to Poland, they very graciously said, look, you can use the free space in our vans to move stuff to Poland. And from there, that's how I came into contact with Igor Tracza, who has done, as it stands, 62 convoys into Ukraine. And once we turned up with a huge amount of stuff, he said, look, do you want to come with us? And this was December of 22. And I sort of looked at my wife looked at me, and she very kindly said, go on, Will, I know you want to go. And subsequent to that, I've done 5 trips, about to do a 6th very shortly. And that's what became the Wall Next Door, which, shameless plug for the book.
And that's extraordinary. So we'll come to the book in a minute, and the journey on sort of writing that and creating it. I'm going on a sort of similar journey myself, trying to work the transcripts and the video into a book format. So that's an exciting thing to sort of announce in the channel later. But I'd like to drill into that. But this primary connection, so you're providing kit because there seems to be a demand for that. But once you get into Ukraine, are you able to understand and refine what kind of stuff is actually required and then change the composition of subsequent convoys? Is it important to have those sort of direct feedback, as it were, from people on the ground?
Yes, it is. And I think, I mean, certainly Igor's experiences, which have sort of fed into what he asked me to try and get hold of, are, I think initially, like a lot of people, he was driving into the west of Ukraine and dropping kit, food, animal food, whatever was needed at sort of key depots. But what then started happening was that he would make contacts with people in certain battalions or certain charities that were much further east. And that's when we were able to make very good links with people who could be very specific about what they needed, including one very badly damaged town in the south of Ukraine, which we've been to on multiple occasions, really to sort of help them get back on their feet. This is a place that's had no running water or power really for 2 years. And there are a group of people who are clinging on to existence there, and they need the basics. And we've sort of, in a way, focused a lot of our attention onto that. And we've, like a lot of other groups, we have sort of key battalions that we support, and we have sort of friends, soldiers at the front who say, look, actually, it was great that you sent socks, but what we really need is trousers or waterproof trousers. Can you get hold of those? And so it becomes quite a sort of specific, please get us this, please get us that. And that drives a lot of the sort of the kit fundraising and everything else that goes with it.
And come into contact with so many people who are so active, some of whom are, still balancing day jobs to do this, others who've, given those up to fully immerse themselves in sort of volunteer activity. Do you get a kind of different impression of humanity doing this than, say, we get from the media? Because there's an awful lot of cynicism and negativity. And in some ways, the way the media frames the kind of tone, I think sometimes it can be quite disempowering, can't it? It can make you feel that the problems are too big for individuals to solve. Whereas your experience seems to suggest that you are in contact with many hundreds of individuals who've decided to go and solve these problems and not let sort of either indifference or the sheer weight of the struggle get on top of them. They're going out and making, direct action, as it were.
You're right. And again, I hope I don't cause offense by saying this, but actually, one of the ways of stopping worrying about Ukraine is to actually go to Ukraine. I find, and you may have found this when you went to Ukraine yourself, that actually when you're in contact, wherever it may be, whether it's Lviv or Kramatorsk or anywhere in between with everyday Ukrainians, fundamentally it's their country, their home, so they're getting on with it. But B, they don't have a choice. So there isn't this introspection. It's pure practicality a lot of the time. And if it's not pure practicality, if there isn't something bad happening, dare I say it, there's a lot of fun and laughter, and people are looking forward to a nice lunch or meeting up with someone for a coffee. And I understand why, but I feel that sometimes that doesn't come across in the media. It's very focused on the sort of disaster. And even in areas we've been to which are absolutely destroyed, you will find people remarkably cheerful. I remember, I didn't actually name it in the book, but when we went to Kupiansk, um, the the one thing that really surprised me was you are literally on the front line, and they will take you up to the park and show you the explosions in the distance. And yet you walk a bit further back, and there are people weeding the flower beds, and people sorting out their shopping, and people talking about where they're going to go for an evening meal. And I just found that remarkable that a the sort of level of courage, but also it's a story that's not really reflected because we understand the media, they want the drama rather than the sort of everyday courage and the fact that the resistance doesn't have to be military. Resistance can be weeding a municipal flower bed. You know, you're showing that it doesn't matter. We've been occupied. We're free again, and we're going to carry on the civic life as we want to. And that was quietly impressive, very impressive.
And it's odd in a way, isn't it? I mean, there's two things that come out of this. One is the way some media is framed is disenfranchising. It takes agency away from people by labeling them as sort of victims. And that's a kind of almost like a lazy narrative. You know, it fits into a certain pattern, a certain trope, and you drop reality into the sort of shape and form that you're used to. And I think there's a lot of that going on. And then you stop to see them as you say, humans with agency and some level of control in their lives and the ability to perhaps organize or take action to reverse some of the bad stuff. The other one, which puzzles me, because talking to relatives like my grandmother who were both through the London Blitz, they'd tell you extraordinary stories of going out dancing um, while the bombs are falling, and then coming back early in the morning after the all clear and walking through devastated streets on their way to work. So we did that. We lived like that. You see films and even the newsreels, people try to grab every experience, and you read accounts in the Second World War, and there's a certain intensity of life there, but also a certain sort of common purpose as well. So it's kind of extraordinary that we have got disconnected perhaps from our own history and experience. Do you feel, however, because many Ukrainians do reshare images of the Second World War and of London in particular and other UK cities, that does seem to create some kind of affinity between Britain and Ukraine, and the fact that Britain was for a considerable number of months on its own in the war, fighting back against Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I do. I think Britain, without sounding like a politician, I think that certainly my experience in Ukraine is being that Britain as a country is perceived as punching above its weight, both in historical terms, as you say, in that sort of standing alone. And I think a lot of Ukrainians identify with that. And people have made the parallels between Churchill and Zelensky at the political level, but also just at the day-to-day level, that somehow you can get through this, that we can get through this, and it's been done before, and we will get through this again. I'd also say that certainly in the east of Ukraine, when you meet a lot of very elderly people, and it seems to be a lot of elderly people who remain behind, they also feel they can get through this because some of them, as children, lived through it in the Second World War. And there's a strange sadness about that they've sort of begun and ended their lives in a really unbelievable total war. And that's interesting. Well, interesting is the wrong word. That's extraordinary. But yes, certainly Britain, I think there are many Ukrainians have said to me that it's interesting. They've been very interested how Britain has responded, and responded very early on. And one of the interesting things about living in Poland and not in the UK is the perception of Boris Johnson. I know in the UK he's sort of vilified now, and I think some of that is justified. I think some of it comes from fellow travellers wanting to undermine a figure who really helped Ukraine. But certainly in Poland and Ukraine, he is seen as an extraordinary figure because of his support in the days of before the invasion of sending NLAWs to help defend Kyiv. Though these things are not forgotten, and I think you're right that idea of Britain standing alone is a big inspiration to many Ukrainians.
And we won't talk too much about military stuff there, but I think it is quite interesting, isn't it? Because if the flow of weapons had been maintained and actually scaled up, following on from that, I would say fairly courageous and imaginative supply of NLAWs, and a high political risk, actually. I have very little positive to say about Johnson, but I think the supply of NLAWs is an extraordinary political gesture and quite a risky one that he took there. If the flow of weapons, however, had escalated from there and increased, we would no longer be talking about that. But actually, it's been an extraordinary story of really partially starving Ukrainians of what they actually need in the fight for a whole range of different reasons. Whether that is not understanding the scale of intensity of warfare, of domestic politics, of sheer bureaucratic inertia, or the other factor clearly that's at play here is the absolute fear of so-called escalation and triggering Russia and a nuclear response and so on. Now, we know that's a significant part of Russian propaganda warfare, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be controlled and coerced by that. But unfortunately, it sort of seems to work. So Johnson's actions there stand out because of the subsequent, I would say, overall sort of weakness or lack of strategy to supply Ukraine for victory.
I agree. I mean, I think one of the things, to be fair to politicians within Europe and in the US, is I think the scale of Ukraine is not fully understood. And if I'm brutally honest, until I went to Ukraine myself, and both of us coming from a little island, I think the sheer scale of Ukraine, which is only sort of Australians and Americans and Canadians would understand in the Anglosphere. I think within Western Europe, we just cannot fathom what is needed in sheer geographical terms. I mean, one of the things that I just found bewildering in a very sad way last summer was when we drove from Kupiansk right down to the south of Ukraine, pretty much along the border or just back from the front line. You drive for hours and hours and hours through ruined towns, hamlets, and buildings to the extent that it looks like CGI, that your brain actually doesn't see it anymore. And what you see as an intact house, and that's the thing that stands out. Oh, look, there's a house with a roof on. And I've said to a number of people who've perhaps been, should we say, a little bit fellow travelers about Ukraine, is if anyone was to do that drive, they would vote for everything we have in the storeroom to be sent to Ukraine right away. And it's the sheer scale of it that I think Western politicians just couldn't understand. It is in the same way that Russia is massive, Ukraine is massive too. And this 600-mile front is quite a sight to behold. It really is.
And that's yeah, I haven't been to those areas. I mean, there will be potentially opportunity to do so later in the year. But the other hideous irony, of course, is, well, that many people who would inhabit those houses would have been brought up as Russian speakers. I mean, Russia is not liberating Russian speakers. It's so-called liberating them from their lives, from their livelihoods, from their homes, destroying their communities, which is intensely frustrating that the propaganda narratives in some quarters, as you say, still cut through. Whereas there you have reality on a phenomenal scale. But when you have distance, all you need is a little bit of information, a few lies, a few sort of weaponized and amplified lies, and that reality that covers thousands and thousands of square kilometers, it's as if it doesn't exist. It's expunged from people's consciousness and the media. I mean, that's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of it. But there is form here. Russia managed to get most of us in the 50 years or so that it occupied following the Second World War. It managed to push much of Central and Eastern Europe out of our consciousness, and much of the detail about its history, identity, architecture, cities, and so on almost laid a kind of blanket of amnesia across Central and Eastern Europe. So Russia has form in being able to do that and change perceptions of reality. Now, you're based in Poland. Surely, given the history and the occupation by the Soviet Union and the proximity to this extraordinary scale of warfare, it must feel more existential in Poland than, say, it would do in Britain, France, or even Germany.
It does. I think, I mean, certainly, and I put a bit about this in the book. I mean, one of the things that always I found quite interesting, and specifically to my wife's grandmother, quite shocking, was that she, and that generation in particular, the generation that survived the Second War, the one thing that would drive terror in their memories, and I wrote a bit about the mistake of unearthing these things, or can be a mistake, was the Russian soldiers. What shocked me about my wife's grandmother was that she would acknowledge that Germany had behaved in a murderous and appalling way in Poland. But this idea that Germany had atoned and done everything it could in the post-war years to rectify that meant that in her later years, she traveled to Germany and felt quite comfortable to do that. But to talk to her about the Russians and what the Russians did twice, as she would say, first they came and she always said that made sure it was twice, was appalling. And it was unpredictably appalling. And what I found very shocking was that when my wife's grandmother, Babcha, told us about what they'd done and the theft and the rape and the irrational violence when there was no need. So she would just describe German violence as being rational in the sense it was derivative of something that had happened. I know that's perhaps sounds offensive, but that's how she would describe it. But the Russian violence would just happen because they were drunk or because they felt like it. And what that meant was that this sort of left, certainly sort of between 1945 and 48, this sort of terrible feeling, not just in Poland, but in many parts of Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe, this utter fear, Stalinist fear of day-to-day life. And I think what that means is in the sort of the folk history or the fireside history of places like Poland or Latvia or Lithuania, Estonia, is this almost fairy tale fear of Russia and what Russians can do. And when we saw what happened in Bucha, Irpin, we realized that actually this fairy tale fear was a real fear. And the sadness was that clearly Russia hasn't changed, that the same activities that took place 80 years ago, the same murder, the same rape, the same theft, happening again. And I think in the West, that doesn't sit as part of our sort of national memory in the way that it does in Eastern Europe, in Poland. And equally, a suspicion of Russia. There's this, one of the things that people don't talk about very much, and I understand why, is when it comes to Ukrainian people or Polish people, or anyone indeed who has a border with Russia, they know what Russia is about, and they know what has to be done. And fundamentally, they know that there is no reasoning with them. And I know that you've had other people recently on the podcast that have sort of said, oh no, that's, Russia bashing, or it's too extreme. But the simple truth is that reason as a concept differs in Russia. I do believe that quite strongly. And in a sense, what we're looking at is a more medieval approach, which is violence will get what I want. It's cheaper. I don't have to care. I don't have to barter or pay for anything. And I'm afraid, as far as I can see from my limited research, this seems to have been the Russian way of doing things for about the last 1,000 years. I've probably got a lot of people telling me off
They
for
will, though.
saying that,
Firstly,
but
they'll tell you off that Russia hasn't
it's
existed for 1,000 years. It only goes back to 1721. But I know what you mean. Muscovy's been around for longer than that, and absolutely, it doesn't seem to have changed too much in terms of the methodology. I'm with you and Keir Giles on that. No matter what guests and what debates we have, I'm on the scale of really you cannot. As I think Golda Meir said, you cannot negotiate with people who've come to kill you.
No, and I think again, this is something in the West that is quietly being removed from the debate, the careful nudging and what have you, and we know where all that comes from. And the fact that Russia has invaded is being strangely removed from the debate. It's this sort of, I've seen several commentators who, quite frankly, I used to respect, I won't name any names, who've started promoting this narrative that, well, they've had much of the Donbass for 10 years now, and they've had much of, they've had Crimea for 10 years. Maybe we're moving to a different phase now. No, if international law is international law, and this nudging is worrying. And I think you're doing great work in challenging this, because it is more noticeable now than it was 2 years ago, in fact.
It is. There's a certain normalization which comes from fatigue, which also comes from narratives that are purposefully placed into the information sphere and left unchallenged. I think that's the trick. Putin's violence and informational warfare only works because it goes unchallenged, because it doesn't meet a sort of stiff resistance to it. It's not that it is all powerful and supremely clever or whatever. It simply pushes until it finds resistance, and then it carries on and finds, looks for another opening where it can gain some advantage. And it's our weakness that has enabled this to happen. There'll be more episodes on that kind of thing, certainly. And this feeds into another one. And, Russian propaganda doesn't invent most of this stuff. It finds weakness and it finds division very readily in our societies, our media, and often in our institutions. And a phrase you used before we hit record, which I find fascinating, is this idea that despite the scale and intensity and the extraordinary trauma and criminality of Russia's invasion, we in Western Europe still have a sense that it's over there. It's distinct from our everyday lives, and it doesn't represent an existential threat. I mean, how dangerous is that mindset, and what do we need to do actually to overcome it?
I think we need to face the fact that, and I was saying this to someone the other day who was a little bit doubtful of what's at stake. And I said to them, look, I can drive you from Avdiivka to where we were talking now. I know every road. I know where you turn left, where you drive another turn. It's not that far away. And my question to that chap was, if they were to break through, they being the Russians, who's to stop them and what would you do? And they didn't have an answer to that other than that's not going to happen, partly because Ukraine is a very big country. And I said, well, if we could drive back in our trucks along great big straight roads, and I have to say, the one thing that I found very surprising is how good Ukrainian roads are. I've been led to believe before I went that they're very bumpy and what have you. Some of them are, but actually The infrastructure is not bad. So it wouldn't take long for a rampaging army to get to Rzeszów or the border of Poland or the border of Slovakia or anywhere else in Central Eastern Europe.
And
And
the
then
Baltics
as
have direct borders, don't they? The Baltics have direct borders with Russia and Belarus, which are essentially under Russian control, and you have the enclave of Kaliningrad. So actually, the Baltics, technically, if NATO offered no response, the Baltics, unlike Ukraine, could be taken extremely quickly. And there are some NATO forces there, but probably not in enough quantities to push back against a significant Russian incursion.
well, it's there's an extraordinary cognitive dissonance. I remember 2 days after the invasion, there was a demonstration in our hometown in support of Ukraine, and everyone was debates here, there, and everywhere. And there were a number of people that said, "Oh, Russia's miles away," and there was a lovely old boy that said, "No, it's not." And then people said, "No, it's miles away." And he said, pointing out across the bay, Kaliningrad is 30 kilometers away. That's where they'd come from, not from Ukraine or the Russian border in the east. And it was extraordinary because people's faces just dropped. And I was saying in support of this guy, didn't you think, you know, didn't you wonder what that exclave was all these years? And clearly people hadn't. But this cognitive dissonance all round is something that, as you say, I think European Union and Britain and America in particular need to get their heads around. This is a real thing, and it's become a kind of, dare I say it, an abstract thing for many people, not for everybody, but for significant numbers of people. It's item number 3 on the news. It's something that's bubbling away, but not number one. And I've said to many people, it should be more than number one. We should be re-gearing our economies and frankly planning for the worst, which I know sounds very glass half empty, but we're about to enter year 3 of a massive war. And still some people are talking about, problems with COVID or, all sorts of stuff, which in my mind is irrelevant now.
That's right. And we're still in some ways living in the 90s dividend, the peace dividend. We talked about this on Maria Report, which is that Russian propaganda did not start in 2022, and it's not all about offensive, threatening propaganda. A lot of it is trying to lull us into a sense of full security. Russia will never attack. Russia's never attacked anybody. Russia is your friend. You don't need to invest in your arms industry. Why don't you take that dividend and use it for something else? We can see that these narratives, very prevalent in the 90s, weren't just stories that we were putting about and telling ourselves. They were actively encouraged by Russia. And despite the state of its economy, I remember being there and having discussions with people about whether there were any visible signs of, Russia dismantling its architecture, especially spy networks and so on, that were built up in the Cold War. And it seemed there was very little evidence that they were deconstructing that. They were perhaps retooling it to industrial espionage, but there was no evidence at all that they were, fundamentally changing and moving on to a peace footing, which of course is what we did. Russian departments which had previously been part funded by the MOD to produce Russian experts. One has to question how expert some of the experts are, but nonetheless, we invested heavily in that. But by the time I came to study Russian, all that funding had disappeared. And this is right at the start of the 90s. So almost immediately after the Berlin Wall, we seemed to deconstruct the entire sort of, not just sort of physical architecture and weaponry and size of our armies, but all of the methodologies and intelligence that was used to decode and push back against Russia. And of course, the investment in soft power. You have to remember in the 60s, 70s, massive investments in soft power culture and so on, to give people a sort of sense of unity, to to have something to protect. I mean, let's not pretend. I mean, a lot of investment went into that, and that was substantially withdrawn and deconstructed through the 90s.
I think one of the problems that the West has, not so much what we call Eastern Europe, because slightly linguistically, but also culturally, that they developed a sort of a defense mechanism in terms of dealing with Russians. I think, and again, this gets into issues of multiculturalism, but I think one of the problems that Western Europe has had in the US is actually in interpreting intent from Russians and from specifically that kind of oligarch or Russian political level of people. And I think often Western kindness, and this probably what you saw when you were in Russia in the early 90s, Western kindness and definitely now can be interpreted as weakness. And weakness is something you must not show to Russians. You know, Poles will, particularly older Poles, will tell you, don't show weakness with them because they'll take a step forward. And culturally, give or take, we're not taught to be like that. You know, you do someone a favor and they'll do you a favor back. Again, a huge generalization, but often with Russians, you do them a favor and they will interpret that as you're bowing to them, that you're weaker and therefore you're seeking favor. And this, I think, created quite a sort of lot of misinterpretations about why people were doing certain things. But also more drastically, I think when it came to particularly Putin's terrible behavior with Litvinenko and then later in Salisbury, we, to a certain extent, didn't respond in the right way. We should have been more robust then, in the same way we should have been more robust in a bigger way about Georgia, and certainly in 2014 about Crimea and the Donbass. And in not doing that, it's many people in the West don't realize the signal you're sending. It's almost an, dare I say it, an animal signal. When an animal detects weakness, the great white shark detecting the weak fish in the water, it encourages what has happened. And that sounds maybe a bit dramatic, but I think you're right to say there's this cultural disconnect between Russia and the West. And because of multiculturalism, we think, oh, we're all kind of the same and we think the same. And at a sort of McDonald's and shopping at Zara or whatever level, we all are. But when it comes to Russia and its projection of power, or how it would like to project power, then the idea of law, following law, negotiation, and so forth, that is not part of their culture. And I think, sadly, we've only discovered this properly in the last 2 years, and that's been hugely sad for everyone concerned.
I suspect it's not even now fully understood, and I think there's a very simplistic idea that helps to cover this partially, and these are only sort of models to help the thinking along. But through our complex manufacturing economies, which require rule of law and certain foundations and institutions, and trust fundamentally as well. Trust is the key point that makes it work. I mean, no constitution, no law is going to be worth the ink, that's put on paper if it's not also has a culture of trust. But that's a necessity for a complex manufacturing economies, and it also gives rise to the concept of a win-win scenario. And you can negotiate hard, but at the end of the day, you go into that with the idea that you can win and the person you're coming into an agreement can win. And if there's trust underpinning it, then you can move forward with that. I think there's a very fundamental idea that the win-win scenario is not part of the Russian psyche. There's only a win-lose. So in whatever transactional arrangement, you have to feel or sense that you've basically pulled one over or done better in that negotiation than somebody else. Or the worst case scenario is that it's a relationship built on the implicit threat of violence. They're doing something for you, not because of a win-win, mutually equal kind of status, but because you have imposed your higher status with the implied threat of violence that then enforces the delivery of whatever agreement that happens to be. So if you go into thinking that Russia does not have the concept of win-win, that means that any negotiation, any negotiated settlement to the war would only happen if Russia sees that it has distinct advantage and has very, very clearly had some sort of status acknowledged by Ukraine demonstrably losing, whether that be territory or justice or whatever. And I think that that's fundamentally actually not understood, even by our policymakers.
I agree with you, and I think that, and conversely, that's what makes Ukraine fundamentally different in the sense that they, in terms of business practice, in terms of the way they view the world, they have adopted those principles in the same way that in the 90s Poland and other countries did, because to be truthful, in Poland, there were problems with people who felt they could take state resources post-communism. And I have to say, the European Union did wonderful work in building institutions and showing that actually rule of law, literally defining ownership. And I think this is an area where, again, people don't realize that in Russia, you don't necessarily own anything. You might do until someone decides they want it. Whereas in Poland and in Ukraine, you are protected. And something I would also say, which again attacks a lot of Russian tropes about Ukraine, is one of the things that you hear all the time, and even now, is, oh, you know, Ukraine is very deeply corrupt. It's a deeply corrupt country. And I'd say, having spent weeks in Ukraine now and in different parts of Ukraine, I have seen nothing at all that would suggest any form of corruption. And having, without sounding too grand, having traveled the world quite a bit through work and so on and so forth, you are aware of when you go to a country where something is happening and you think, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. They want marketing budget. They need this to, and it's quietly couched in something else, but it's actually corruption in the Western terms. I've seen none of that in Ukraine. In fact, quite the opposite. In Kupiansk, for example, you know, very diligent, decent local government. I mean, quite frankly, in some ways, better local government than many parts of the UK in terms of interaction with population, services being provided as best they can. Equally, in other areas where potentially there could be corruption, everything done with an absolutely straight bat. And maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I don't think so. And I think this myth of corruption, I think actually Ukrainian corruption was actually Russian corruption that existed before Ukraine got out from under, particularly after 2014. And actually, once that had been scraped away, once the Ukrainian president had fled after 2014, I think that enabled Ukraine almost to sort of, rather like the Theoden king in Lord of the Rings, the sort of the Russian spell broke, and they were able to be themselves commercially, legally, and in every way. And again, I'm sure some people might think I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I absolutely, this idea of, oh, it's so corrupt, it just drives you around the twist, because it's everything I've seen with a total straight bat. In some cases, perhaps overly so, you know, very bureaucrat, making sure I's are dotted, yes, I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Quite the reverse. So again, as you say, it's these Russian tropes which are fed into the narrative, and no one really challenges them. It absolutely drives me around the twist sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, there clearly is still graft that goes on, but there also seems to be an intense effort to make that the aberration rather than the norm. Whereas I wouldn't even say that Russia has corruption. it is systemically corrupt. It's built into every transaction and every relationship. And people are going to find this idea shocking, but it's something I've been telling Russians and people since I was there in the 90s. And that's the idea that you don't own anything. And a lot of people try to persuade me to, you could get rich much quicker if you went and lived there and worked there. But I left in 98. And I formed the idea right back then that you do not own anything at all. You essentially lease your wealth. Your wealth is granted to you, and it's based on a certain understanding. And in the 90s and 2000s, well, in the 2000s, it was based on do not be involved in politics, and we will grant you the right to, carry on your economic existence. Now, there is more of an onus placed on people. They have to, actively be supportive of the war, not speak out against it. There's a greater demand out of the quid pro quo, but it's a fundamentally different system that when people equate Ukraine and Russia, I don't think understand. I did want to do an interview with a fantastic Finnish intelligence officer, unfortunately, a real expert from the Cold War on the Russian system and how it came about. Unfortunately, he passed away. The title of that episode was going to be Tenured Thievery. And I think that is the system that Russia has. The state grants you the privilege to harvest parts of the economy, but it can take that back at any time. And it's a curious irony you mentioned this because just this week, Russia has passed a law that it can confiscate the entire property of anybody who criticizes the army, anybody who does not show loyalty to the state. That is just putting into law, I think, something that already existed in practice and has never gone away.
Over the last couple of years, both in Poland and the UK, one of the things that's been interesting and I'm sure you've heard many stories like this, the anecdotes of people who, whether it be the early 90s or even until more recently, tried to do business in Russia. And actually, the very different businesses. People like spring to mind was a drainage business, an advertising business, a consultancy business. The one common denominator was that in the end, they all lost massive amounts of money. And another common denominator was they were massively glad to get out of Russia. And in one case, in one piece. And crazy things like the consultancy guy was telling me that they were paying a fortune for a building in Moscow. And they were happy to do it because it was a good location, as all consultancies need to be, and it was all, very glamorous, etc. And then one morning they arrived, and there were sort of lots of heavies outside, and weren't quite sure what was going on, but they were being prevented from going into the building by the landlord. And if my memory is correct, the guy was telling me that initially they thought, oh gosh, there's been a problem with the money transfer or whatever. Actually, what transpired was that the landlord had decided that actually the agreed rent wasn't correct, and he wanted to increase the rent. And of course, chap I was talking to said, well, we've got an agreement, it's all in writing. And at that point, he realized, that agreement in writing is not worth the paper it's printed on. And if he wanted to get into the building, he'd have to pay the extra few million ruble or whatever it was that was required. And very shortly, they found another location outside of Russia to sort of trade from. And I don't think that's an extraordinary story. In fact, probably quite normal for many Western businesses, particularly bureaucratic businesses setting up in Moscow and probably St. Petersburg as well.
Well, that was a classic takeover technique, takeover Russian style in the 90s. And the subway chain, I believe, experienced that at some point. And that is, yeah, you turn up to your place of work, you find armed security guards. At that point, they were called OMON. And yeah, basically, they would take over your business. They would falsify shareholding records. They would force you to take a massive haircut on your ownership. In return, you get away with your life, but you maybe realize only a tenth of the value or a hundredth of the value, whatever it is, of your business. And that is a hostile takeover Russian style. Well, I don't want to end
Russian
on Russia.
style.
Yeah, I never want to end on Russia. I always want to end on Ukraine, something positive. If we go back to this idea of trust, what you've also observed, I think, in Ukraine is innovation and the power of civic society, people innovating, but also companies and innovating technologies, both civic and to support the war effort. Fundamentally, you cannot do this in a society that doesn't have, a firm rule of law. When it comes to technology, of course, the law has always played catch up to try and legislate for technologies that are already potentially being developed and going to market. But what's your impression really of innovation in Ukraine, the culture that surrounds it, and the glue that enables it, which of course is a level of sort of trust that is an essential feature.
It's interesting you asked that because on a run we did to Ukraine last April, we were with a Polish journalist who was doing a lot of photography. This is so on that run we went to that was our first run right into the Donbass, and we actually went to Adivka, not quite as kinetic as it is now, but it was still a bit bit way. But on the way back, we stopped at a fantastic supermarket, beautifully stocked and what have you. And I said, "Oh, we must get a photograph of this." And he said, "No, because I think if people saw this, they perhaps would lose sympathy for Ukraine." And I said, "No, it to my mind, it shows that there's a lot of Ukraine that's functioning in my opinion, really, really well. That supermarket was well stocked. There were cheerful people in there, wonderful service because I wanted to get some particular type of honey of all things, and they went and found it for me, and it was great. And in that particular town, it felt like a busy, functioning European town, and there were clearly different industries and business there. Perhaps the only difference is that you see a lot of proportionate to Europe, a considerable number of people in uniform or in some form of military clothing. But across Ukraine, outside of the military zone, you find that the cities and towns there's interesting local businesses, interesting small businesses setting up, a lot of innovation, and also tremendous service. We had a problem with one of the vehicles, and it actually needed a whole electronic overhaul. And it's one of the things that normally, not to be disparaging about UK mechanics or Polish mechanics, you'd have to wait a few days for it to be fixed. It may be because we were doing charity work, but this Ukrainian Gower set to and just basically rebuilt this vehicle in about 2 or 3 hours. And the level of knowledge, level of innovation, the pace at which things are done is really impressive there. And it is to their massive credit how it could be a cafe or it could be mechanics or everything is done with an urgency and an efficiency which we could do very well to replicate in the West, certainly.
And it's extraordinary as well, isn't it? Given how many people are at the front, how many people with expertise are taken out of their civil jobs, and actually how many left the country to go abroad. It's extraordinary that this level of speed in repairing stuff is still there, and that's the impression. I only went to Lviv, of course, but I got the impression of extraordinary care and attention to detail. Whether it's people's gardens, which are generally kind of immaculate, no evidence of sort of the vandalism and thievery, which unfortunately is a characteristic of the Russian countryside, or parts of the Russian countryside and villages. Arson was a big thing. I saw no evidence of sort of willful arson taking place. An extraordinary level of order, which was almost ubiquitous, which talks to a very sophisticated, I would say, sort of culture, social culture, and of course a level of trust, which is absent in Russia.
The sense of working together. I know that it's almost a cliche how the country Ukraine has come together to defend itself. But it is absolutely true, and that wherever you go, if you need help, it's just there. I mean, even to the extent we were driving in July of last year, again back east, back to the front there, and we were driving through a small village, and there was one patch of road actually that wasn't very good, so we had to slow right down. And as we did, the villagers are coming out with beautiful cakes, sandwiches, frozen compote, because it was unbelievably hot day. Extremes of Ukrainian winters and summers are incredible. But everywhere you go, the people just want to help or be involved or advise. It is remarkable. And again, I think it's one of the reasons why Ukraine will win, because you cannot defeat that mindset. It is absolutely rigid in a good way, and it is very, very powerful.
Well, it's been a huge pleasure speaking, Will. I wish you tremendous luck with subsequent convoys. We're going to put sort of links in the description to, for anybody who's interested in helping out or learning what they can do. We'll put your LinkedIn profile in here as well so they could get in contact. I know people often ask that question, well, what can I do? How can I get involved? I also, of course, encourage them very much to read the books. I think it's an extraordinary first-hand account of your experience in Ukraine and putting these convoys together. And of course, it's doing really well in the Amazon charts. I know that's probably, as you say, your mum clicking on the link there, but
I'm sure it's my mum.
But it's a tremendous achievement, and I wish you luck
Thank you.
in the subsequent work that you're doing.
Thank you very much indeed.